So these fracture zones wouldn't be intrinsically problematic, ultimately, except for the fact that bears tend to die there. In fact, causes of bear death, as well as death rates, are ultimately going to be the determinants of the fates of populations and explanation for the history of populations, especially here focusing on what's happened with yak and cabinet grizzly bears. But before I get into specific causes, I think it's worth recognizing, important to recognize, that just about all of the adolescent and adult bears that die because a human kills them. So 80 to 90% of the total. So if we want to understand why the populations are as small as they are, what's likely going to govern the fate of these populations, we need to understand why humans are killing these bears. But before getting into specific causes, I think it's important to have a conceptual framework to work with. So the outcome of interest is the number of bears dying from human causes, but that axiomatically is going to be a function of how often grizzly bears run into people, so frequency of encounters. But then given that there's an encounter, the likelihood that it will turn lethal for the involved bear, so lethality of encounter. And it's useful to differentiate these two phenomena because they're driven by entirely different suites of factors. So starting with frequency of contact, it obviously matters how many people there are. The more people, the more likely it is that bears are going to run into one of us. But then given a certain number of people, it matters how much access we have into areas where grizzly bears live. And moreover, it matters whether there are things around where we live that will be attracting bears to us, anthropogenic attractants like dog food, garbage, beehives, fruit trees. And it also matters whether we've built our houses and are active in places where there happen to be the greatest concentrations of rich native foods. That will also increase the likelihood that bears will encounter humans. Looking at the lethality part of the equation then, the likelihood that a bear will end up dead given an encounter, obviously it matters whether we're armed. An unarmed human is not going to be much of a threat to a bear. But it also matters the intentions we bring with us into encounters with bears, whether we are going out specifically with the intent of killing a grizzly, as would a poacher, as would a trophy hunter, or whether we intend to not be very tolerant of any risks posed by a bear. So again, turning an encounter lethal pretty quickly. But all of that nested in this smush of stuff that social psychologists call values, attitudes, and worldviews that configures both whether we're armed and also what our intentions are. So with that in mind, then, you can envision an environment where grizzly bears are relatively frequently running into people, but where the people are quite benign, so where there's low lethality. Think of national parks. So under these circumstances, we can have grizzly bears and people encountering each other quite often and yet have a healthy grizzly bear population. By contrast, we have environments where grizzly bears are not encountering very many people at all, but where each one of those encounters is very likely to turn lethal for the involved bear. Almost certainly the case for encounters between people and bears between 1800 and 1950 when most of the extirpations occurred, but also typifying environments where we have trophy hunting or where we have people that are highly intolerant of grizzly bears. So with that framework in mind, then let's look at specific causes. And I think it's important to look at causes in a comparative sense. So comparing relative importance of causes from one ecosystem to another. So in this case, looking at causes differentiating the east front of the northern continental divide from the west side, from the Cabinet-Yaak. And so in these pie diagrams, different causes of death are differentiated by different colors. And here what I'm focusing on are causes of death related to conflicts with humans over meat, specifically encounters with big game hunters or conflict over livestock depredation. And you can see that the east front of the Rockies stands out in that these meat-related conflicts account for a good proportion of grizzly bear deaths, unlike on the west side or in the Cabinet-Yaak. Turning to causes that are more overtly related just simply to sheer numbers of people, collisions with vehicles, conflicts over garbage, conflicts over bears killing small animals confined near residences such as chickens or goats or pigs. And you can see it's here that the west side of the Northern Continental Divide stands out, where that is the dominant cause of grizzly bear death, at least human-caused grizzly bear deaths, compared to especially the Cabinet-Yaak. So what distinguishes the Cabinet-Yaak? Well, it's actually distinguished, for good or for bad, by the dominance of causes related to overt human lethality. It's here that black bear hunters mistaking grizzly bears for black bears that is proportionally a major cause of death for grizzlies. But more than that, where what I would call unjustified killing is a dominant cause of grizzly bear deaths. And this includes instances of verified poaching, but also a bunch of other instances where there's good reason to doubt the reasons why the involved human ended up killing the grizzly. All of this under the larger rubric then of unjustified killing. Now, it's the nature of especially unjustified killing, poaching, that we tend to pretty substantially underestimate the number of bears dying for those reasons because they are underreported. But when we try to account for that unreported number of bear deaths, estimate what that number might be, this is what we end up with. Where between unjustified killing and mistaken ID, those two causes account for probably roughly 3/4 of all the human-caused grizzly bear deaths in the Cabinet-Yaak, unlike any other ecosystem, including the greater Yellowstone. So, with that in mind then, and focusing on the Cabinet-Yaak, we don't have much in the way of opportunities to affect whether people carry a firearm, what their behavioral intentions might be, at least not to any extent, and certainly not people's underlying values, attitudes, and worldviews. So by default then, lacking those means to engage with lethality outright, we end up focusing on phenomena such as human densities and amount of road access. And in fact, we really don't have much control either over how many people choose to live in an area, other than perhaps buying conservation easements. So all of then the management actions by default get loaded on to controlling access into grizzly bear habitat. And again, emphasizing that is by default and a artifact of the largely of our inability to directly intervene on the lethality side of things. So given those causes, given the dominance of human lethality as a concern in the Cabinet-Yaak, given the extent to which access management features, to a lesser extent human densities, it's worth then looking at the spatial configuration of hazards organized around human densities, population densities, as well as access. And by subtraction, essentially, where we have core grizzly bear habitat. So starting with human densities. It's worth putting what we have here in the Selkirk and Cabinet-Yaak ecosystems in context of human densities in other ecosystems or other portions of ecosystems. So you can see Selkirk, Cabinet-Yaak, the bar farthest to the left, Northern Continental Divide west and east, and Greater Yellowstone, the height of the bars proportional to average human population densities in each. You can see that the Northern Continental Divide west stands out with much, much higher human densities. Not surprising if anybody's traveled through the Flathead Valley recently. And explaining then why causes of death related to just sheer human numbers dominate in this part of the world as well. But interestingly, the Selkirks and the Cabinet-Yaak are not all that different from what we find in the NCDE East or Greater Yellowstone, at least in terms of numbers of people, densities of humans. So we wouldn't expect then for human densities overtly to be a driver. Despite that, when we look at a relationship between where we're likely to have grizzly bears versus densities of people, here represented by an XY diagram, the vertical or y-axis representing likelihood of grizzly bears being present, the x-axis left to right, increasing densities of people, you can see we have a strong negative relationship. And increasingly lethal habitat conditions as we get out towards 15 to 20 people per square mile. Notably, that's in the range of what we find along Highway 2 and Highway 200 in the Cabinet-Yaak ecosystem. So looking at where we have core grizzly bear habitat, at least as Troy and I modeled it in a research paper we produced several years back, juxtaposed with human densities, not surprisingly, there's a marked dissociation. Where we have lots of people, we don't have lots of grizzly bears. Because when grizzly bears venture into these areas with people, they tend to die quite quickly. So kind of an artifactual relationship, if you will. So it's useful, though, again, to get a sense of the relationship, the correlation between mortality spatially and human densities, to step back and look at multiple regions or several ecosystems. Here again, the Northern Continental Divide, Cabinet-Yaak, core grizzly bear distribution, but also human densities. Overlay on that, then, each one of these red dots representing a location where a grizzly bear was known to die. And you can see that there's a pretty striking concentration of dead bears in areas with high densities of people on the west side of the Northern Continental Divide, constituting a highly lethal landscape for grizzlies, but much less so for grizzlies in the Cabinet-Yaak. Yes, there are a certain number of grizzlies that have died near where we have lots of people, but here in the Cabinet-Yaak, most grizzly bears that die actually tend to die in the backcountry, unlike in the NCDE. And again, that's probably an artifact of grizzly bears not really having been able to survive for any period of time, not for a long period of time, in the lowland areas where there are lots of people in the Cabinet-Yaak. So the only place where grizzly bears end up dying is where they continue to hang on, which is in the backcountry. So, what about roadless areas or road access? Here again, I've put the Selkirk and Cabinet-Yaak in comparison to other ecosystems here. The percent of all public lands that are roadless, the dark green, the percentage that's protected roadless area, the light green unprotected roadless area, but functionally all of that being roadless insofar as grizzly bear survival is concerned. And here is where the Selkirk and Cabinet-Yaak ecosystems stand out as having far less roadless area compared to any of the other grizzly bear ecosystems. In fact, only about half the extent of roadless areas. as what we find anywhere else that we have grizzly bears. And that's predictably going to be problematic, given, as I've said, that people tend to be, probably by all indications, more lethal in this part of the as with the relationship between the likelihood of grizzly bears being present and human densities, we have a similar relationship between the likelihood of grizzly bears being present and road densities. So again, y-axis probability of a grizzly bear being in an area, left to right, increasing densities of roads, and again, a negative relationship. Not quite as strong as we had with human densities, but there nonetheless. This is based on the modeling that Troy and I did, being remarkably consistent with what Wayne Wakinen and Wayne Kaysworm came up with as well. So we get out into a relatively lethal zone anytime we have in excess of roughly 2 miles per square mile of roads in an area. So again, looking at this in map form, here in yellow is everything in U.S. Forest Service jurisdiction, but also everything in burgundy. Yellow, though, is roadless area. Increasingly dark burgundy denotes increasing densities of roads. Overlay on that then, again, core grizzly bear range. And again, you have a disassociation spatially. Core grizzly bear distribution is concentrated in areas without roads. So then, notably, roughly 30% of all the Forest Service lands in the Cabinet-Yaak have in excess of 1 mile per square mile of roads. But even more notably, nearly a full quarter of all Forest Service jurisdictions have more than 2 miles per square mile of roads. So representing landscapes that are quite hostile to grizzly bears, where grizzly bears are likely to have problems surviving more so than in more remote areas, given that they range in these sorts of environments or land. So here again, we have that map of recorded grizzly bear mortalities overlain on top of U.S. Forest Service jurisdictions and road densities. And here it's pretty clear just by visual inspection that in both the Cabinet-Yaak and the NCD ecosystems, there's a disproportionate concentration of bear deaths in these roaded Forest Service landscapes. So again, landscapes that are lethal by virtue of these high road densities. And management of roads on Forest Service jurisdictions is intimately intertwined with, connected with, management for industrial scale extraction of timber. So everything in dark burgundy here is where Forest Service lands have been prioritized for timber extraction. You can see that there's a remarkable concentration of these industrial timberlands in the landscape between the NCDE and Cabinet and Yaak, but also intruding into the Yaak in particular. But that doesn't explain what's been going on in the cabinets, because here we have a significant amount of unprotected roadless area as well as protected roadless area, but also a lot of dead bears. And I think the explanation for the precariousness of the cabinet population, the number of dead bears there, has to do with a phenomenon that I highlighted in my history of extirpations of grizzlies in the West. The problems that come when you have a distribution that's long and narrow. No matter how large it is, if it's long and narrow, there will be ample opportunities for people to intrude into that distribution and for there to be problematic interactions, including poaching of grizzly bears, which is almost certainly what's been happening in the Cabinet Mountains and why the Cabinet population of grizzly bears is doing so poorly. So with that in mind, the importance of roads in mind, especially in the Yaak portion of the ecosystem, it's interesting to compare security standards as they relate to management of roads in the Kootenai National Forest with the Flathead National Forest. Now, you would expect that these standards, in light of what I've presented, to be more stringent in the Kootenai National Forest. And in fact, what we find is just the opposite. So what I'm showing you here is the relationship or the ratio of the security standards on the Kootenai National Forest to the standards on the Flathead National Forest. So this vertical dashed black line represents parity, a 1.0 ratio. So where you would have equivalence between standards for the Kootenai as well as the Flathead. If we were managing more stringently to benefit grizzly bears, we'd expect the bars that I'm showing here to be somewhere to the left of that line of parity. But in fact, what we have is just the opposite. So the further to the right, the less that parity is, in a way that poses greater risk for grizzly bears. So the area that's allowed with greater than 1 mile per square mile is 1.7 times greater on the Kootenai than the Flathead. The area with greater than 2 miles per square mile, 1.4 times greater on the Kootenai compared to the Flathead. And overall, what's allowed for in terms of unsecure habitat, roughly 20% more is allowed on the Kootenai compared to the Flathead. So again, just the opposite of what logic would recommend that you do if you want to help recover populations like we have in the yak and the cabinets in the kinds of landscapes that they occupy. So begging the question of how we ended up there, which is a whole nother talk, I think. But nonetheless, it makes absolutely no sense if, in fact, managers are serious about recovering grizzly bears in this. But all of what I've been sharing related to the effects or relations between where we have grizzly bears and human densities and access is against this backdrop, this elephant in the living room of the dominance of unjustified killing as the main reason why bears die. Really then relating back to the lurking issue of human lethality. If people were less lethal, we almost certainly could have more bears occupying areas with higher human densities. We could certainly have more bears occupying and surviving in areas with higher road access densities.